beyond a reasonable doubt, is the highest standard of proof used in legal proceedings, primarily in criminal cases. It signifies that the evidence presented must be so convincing and compelling that there is no reasonable uncertainty regarding the defendant's guilt. This standard is a cornerstone of the justice system, ensuring that individuals are not wrongfully convicted without substantial proof of their guilt. Definition of beyond a reasonable doubt. Beyond a reasonable doubt means that the evidence presented by the prosecution in a criminal trial must be so conclusive and complete that there are no reasonable doubts left in the mind of a reasonable person regarding the defendant's guilt. This does not mean absolute certainty, but rather that the level of certainty achieved leaves no reasonable alternative explanations. Key components of the standard high level of certainty. The jury or judge must be almost certain of the defendant's guilt based on the evidence. The doubt must be reasonable and not based on mere speculation or hypothetical scenarios. Protection of the innocent. This stringent standard emphasizes protecting individuals from wrongful convictions. The burden rests entirely on the prosecution to prove guilt. The defendant does not need to prove innocence. Moral certainty. The evidence must reach a level of moral certainty, where reasonable individuals would agree on the defendant's guilt after considering all evidence and arguments. Application in legal proceedings. Beyond a reasonable doubt is primarily used in criminal cases, given the serious consequences of criminal convictions, such as loss of liberty, fines, and a permanent criminal record. Here's how it is applied. Role of the prosecution. The prosecution carries the burden of proof and must present evidence that convinces the jury or judge of the defendant's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Failure to meet this standard results in acquittal. Role of the defense. The defense's role is to create reasonable doubt by challenging the prosecution's evidence, presenting alternative explanations, or highlighting inconsistencies and weaknesses. The defense is not required to prove the defendant's innocence. Role of the jury. Jurors must evaluate all evidence presented, weigh its credibility, and apply the beyond a reasonable doubt standard to determine the verdict. Jurors must be in unanimous agreement that the prosecution has met this burden to render a guilty verdict. Judicial instructions. Judges provide instructions to the jury, explaining the meaning of beyond a reasonable doubt and how to apply it when deliberating on the case. Examples and comparisons. To better understand beyond a reasonable doubt, it's useful to compare it with lower standards of proof used in other legal contexts. Preponderance of the evidence application. Civil cases. Standard requires that the evidence shows that something is more likely true than not, greater than 50% certainty. Comparison, significantly lower than beyond a reasonable doubt, which requires near certainty. Clear and convincing evidence application. Certain civil cases and special circumstances, e.g., fraud. Standard requires a higher degree of certainty than preponderance of the evidence, but lower than beyond a reasonable doubt. Comparison requires a firm belief in the truth of the allegations, but it is still less stringent than the criminal standard. Challenges and considerations. Subjectivity. Jurors' understanding of what constitutes reasonable doubt can vary, introducing subjectivity into the decision-making process. Judges' instructions aim to clarify this, but individual interpretations can still differ. Reasonable doubts versus unreasonable doubts. Not all doubts are reasonable. A doubt based on imaginary or improbable scenarios is not considered reasonable. Reasonable doubts arise from logical inconsistencies, lack of evidence, or credible alternative explanations. Significance in trials. The high threshold ensures that only those whom the evidence overwhelmingly points to as guilty are convicted. The fairness of the criminal justice system relies on the diligent application of this standard.